Are we making any sort of progress against the fight of gender-based violence and child abuse and femicide in South Africa? The country turned purple on Friday, just as President Ramaphosa had classified gender-based violence and femicide as a national disaster. This was followed by the gazetting of that classification by the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. Last night, the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Vetten, had his first interministerial committee meeting where all the relevant ministries came together to discuss what the road forward is to give life to this classification. But more importantly, last year in July, the President had signed into law the National Council on Gender-Based Violence, bringing to an end the Presidential Commission on Gender-Based Violence, which he had instituted after 2021 national shutdown. Has this brought about any sort of change and or progress on the fight against gender-based violence? We discussed this with the Director for Wise for Africa, Advocate Brenda Madumise, and the gender equity researcher, Dr. Lisa Vetten. Brenda and Lisa, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Really do appreciate it. Perhaps to start here, both of you are intimately involved in the activism and, of course, the necessary litigation policy work and the necessary sort of public awareness around gender-based violence and the various frameworks and instruments which we use to fight gender-based violence and to bring perpetrators to account. What are your reactions? Brenda, I'll start with you, to the classification of gender-based violence. And now, specifically say classification because last night, the Minister of Cooperative Governance says there's a difference between a declaration and a classification. For the one, you need to write regulations. For the other, not necessarily so. What is your reaction to the classification of gender-based violence and femicide as a national disaster?
It's cowardness, cowardness on their part, because nothing stopped them from declaring it as a national disaster. Classification is just appeasing us again in how they've been conducting themselves all along. And if you look at what they have done, literally, they were put under pressure because of the protest that was going to happen on the 21st of November and worried about what the message that protest is going to send for the G20 meeting. So we're going to act in a rush quickly and find a way to say to all of us and clap and be excited that we now have declared GBV as a national disaster, when in fact, we have classified it with no resources. We're going to pull resources from different ministries and see what we can do. We're going to look at the existing interventions that have not been working thus far. That IMC that he had pulled in today has not been meeting, but we were told that there's an IMC that's supposed to coordinate the GBV work, and that has not happened. So for me, it's just another playing to the gallery again, and they were cowards for not being bold and courageous enough to declare it a national disaster and pull resources to be able to, focus on what needs to be done to be able to really stem this tide against violence against women and children.
Yeah. Lisa, do you share a similar sentiment?
Because I do think that, in 2020, government did adopt its National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, which did set out a whole range of strategies and interventions along with indicators. So there is a plan in place. The question I think we have to ask is, why has the plan not necessarily had the success people hoped it would have? I think it's accomplished some things, but it hasn't necessarily accomplished other things. So I think before abandoning it and starting something new, it would be useful to look at how do we strengthen this plan, how do we revise it, and where is it not working? So I think that would be important, because to disrupt a plan by introducing a new plan where you haven't really finished the first plan, which was intended to be a 10-year plan, I think can create quite a lot of disruption in systems. So it's, I think, trying to understand what's not working as you want and how do we strengthen it at this point without necessarily starting all over again and going back to the drawing board. When there already was a very broad consultation process between 2018 and 2020 that involved very many organizations across the country. So I think it would be useful to look at why do people feel that that's not working and what needs to be done differently. I have my thoughts on why it's not working as it should, but yeah, that's another discussion.
Yeah, let's talk about the signing of the National Council into law last year. The National Council Act, the National Council of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Act came into law in July last year. Has anything significantly come out of that, Brenda, since the signing into law of that, that is noteworthy?
Yeah, so what they have done is to call for nominations of individuals to serve on the National Council. That advert closed now in November, if I'm not mistaken. Then the process to interview by the portfolio committee will start in earnest, and I guess they will appoint. However, civil society had intervened to demonstrate to government why the National Council, as proposed currently in that law, is flawed, right? So they have written to the portfolio committee to address those flaws. In fact, the portfolio committee itself had been working on making some amendments to the existing act of establishing the National Council. So there are issues with the act as is, and I don't think it's going to give us the results that we are looking for as set out in the National Strategic Plan. And it's unfortunate, but I think they're going to move ahead and make the appointments, again, with no budget allocation for this National Council. They did indicate that they want the National Council to be set up by 1st of April 2026, because then there will be some budget allocation of what we are not told. So yeah, it's another struggle that we keep on and meeting with the wall, hitting the wall on some of these things and just listening. I mean, that we are at this point where they have decided to declare and classify gender-based violence as a national disaster, when we had been making the point and driving hard why we should fund the National Strategic Plan and, in fact, prioritize and accelerate certain interventions, and they did not act. And they act because
Madumise, just to pause you there.
That's the issue.
Was the National Strategic Plan unfunded, or was it poorly funded?
It was unfunded.
Entirely.
Entirely. I mean, the Minister of Women claims that they were allocated 5 million. So what do you do with 5 million every year since the NSP was handed over to government? So that's what they claim. So they need to be, asked what that 5 million has done over the years until now that you are going to appoint individuals to serve in the National Council of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide.
Yeah. Listen, I want us to talk about the reality on the ground when it comes to seeking justice, and that is what happens in our courtrooms when victims of gender-based violence and victims of rape seek justice in the courts. We have been told that the court roll is so extensively long that the backlog almost itself presents those who are survivors with the prospect of injustice just by how long they're meant to be waiting. And meanwhile, many of them are being persecuted in the interim by their perpetrators, many of whom come out and often do get released on bail in the interim pending trial. Have we thought sufficiently around how to deal with the cases in our courts pertaining to rape and gender-based violence in a way that best protects victims?
I don't think so, and I think that's why I want to go back to the point where you can't really say the problems we have are those of a disaster. What they reflect is a state and its institutions that are in decay. So, in a sense, if you want to make better services to rape survivors, you have to fix up the courts as a whole. Because at the moment, it's trivial. It seems like on the surface, what are trivial things are actually acting as highly significant obstacles to justice. So the fact that people don't enter into contract to get things like microphones. You cannot have a trial unless you can record it. And if the microphone is not working, then you have to postpone it. So you end up with cases that can be postponed 4, 5, and 6 times because nothing is working. The closed circuit television doesn't work, so you have to transfer the case to another court. That court is now managing up to 3 other court caseloads because it's the only one with functioning closed circuit television. So you build up the case backlog. You don't have a sufficient number of magistrates. You don't necessarily have a sufficient number of specialized prosecutors. You don't necessarily have enough intermediaries. And that's before we've got the problems with whether or not the defendant's attorney has come to court for the day. So there's a lot of systemic problems that are really getting in the way and are obstacles to justice. And in fact, the Public Protector's report speaks very eloquently to this. And she came to the conclusion that, what the department needs to do is to actually spell out, and I'll use the example of the domestic violence court, because we've done this for the sexual offence. No one has actually sat down and said, what does a domestic violence court look? How many people in a day? How many clerks do we need? How many magistrates do we need? What will they cost? Do we have enough space in the courts to give them confidential space where they can go and speak? If we don't, do we have a budget in order to build and create those private spaces? So, that very basic planning is not happening, which is why you don't get an adequate budget, because you haven't sat and thought through all the planning.
Yeah.
So I think it's at that level where so many things are breaking down and why we don't get enough budget.
Yeah. Brenda, you've written extensively about what goes wrong in the prosecutorial processes that unfold particularly when it comes to rape. For instance, that the rules of court seem to still allow for what is intrusive, dehumanizing questioning of witnesses that subjects them to secondary trauma, and oftentimes that results in many of them pulling out from cases because they either want to avoid having to go through that or want to, just entirely make this thing go away. And they then say justice should never cost that much of my mental health. Talk to us about what it is that we aren't getting right in the prosecutorial processes when it comes to gender-based violence and rape.
I think I got a call today from someone a young girl was raped in Mthatha. The way the prosecutor handled that case, they had to change. They are on a third prosecutor, because what's happening with the prosecutors is because they claim that they've got a huge role and they can't cope. What they do is just to get by and not pay attention to most of these cases that are on their desk. So on the day of the matter being heard is when they interact with the docket or the file that is before them. They have not prepped their witnesses. They have not prepped the victim or the survivor. So you have a prosecutorial team that is not invested in the way that we want them to be, and just to also understand the language and know what kind of things to say or not say, to object when certain line of questioning is put forward to an accused to the accuser. So it's a lot of things that we need to get right, and the basics we need to get right. We need to have people who are passionate about doing that work and wanting to see success of them getting convictions with their cases, but not just people wanting to get by because it's a job that they have to do.
We talk about specialized courts. Is it time that we start talking about specialized prosecutors to deal with this as a sort of as a narrow beat rather than being a generalist when it comes to prosecutions?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Listen, I think you
Yes,
should.
and
So if you're going to have FCS, which are specialized...
Miss, I'll come to you just now on this. So, Brenda, go for it.
Okay, so if you're going to have FCS units that are geared and to focus on family violence and all of that, nothing stops you from doing the same with a prosecutorial team, right? That is trained to really understand the depth of the cases, understand what is sexual assault, sexual violence, how it manifests itself, rape, and all of that. So you have generalists, you have prosecutors who are given multiple cases. Today it's criminal, tomorrow is civil, tomorrow is family court, tomorrow is domestic violence. And so there's no one specializes in the area that much. And I think we need to invest in all of that, in ensuring that every court, not just the sexual offences court, but other courts have those kinds of people who can fight for victims and survivors of gendered violence.
Dr. Vetten, you wanted to add your voice to that?
Yes, I mean, I think that's one of the things that is important that came out of the Copter Minister's statement, was to increase the number of sexual offences courts and the number of tutuzelas, because that's where you do have specialised staff. And specialized prosecutors do make a difference. Rape is not like prosecuting a housebreaking. You need to understand the impact of trauma, how that's going to affect the way in which somebody gives testimony, how to build trust and rapport with your witness so that your witness will trust you enough to tell you what actually happened, and will be able to work, and you'll be able to work well when it comes to giving evidence. You'll also need a prosecutor who needs to understand the case law in this area, and who also knows, when they need an expedite staff generally. These cases take a long time. And I think especially where where there's been a great deal of trauma, or where somebody has been close to, or again, you need to do a lot to build somebody's confidence in order to be able to get them ready to be able to testify. And when you don't have that, when you have somebody who is chopping and changing from housebreaking, or doesn't want to do rape because they find it too traumatizing, or because it takes too long, or because your chances of conviction are that much more challenging, then you've got this.
Yeah, Lisa, we're going to have to leave it there. The line is beginning to fail on us there, but I'm going to have to leave it there. Dr. Lisa Vetten, as well as Advocate Brenda Madumise, thank you so much for your time this evening. Really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for your insights.